Part 1. A childhood measured in frost. You didn't need the internet to know how cold it was. You could hear it in the way the wood stove moaned when you opened the door, in the sharp crack of ice forming on the inside of the window, in the way your breath froze into tiny crystals that drifted to the floor like dust. I was born in a village so far north that the map forgot our name. Yakusha, the coldest inhabited place on Earth. Winter wasn't a season here. It was a wall that stood for 9 months straight, made of snow, wind, and air so sharp it cut through wool. 7-1-C wasn't a number to us. It was simply outside. And outside was where you went only if you had no choice. We had no internet, no cell signal, no television except for one channel that worked on clear days when the wind came from the south. Our network was the kitchen table, where stories passed from mouth to mouth like bread. If you wanted to know the news, you waited until the next hunter came in from the forest with frost on his beard and a pocket full of rumors. The day began before the sun, because the sun barely came at all in winter. My father woke us with the scrape of his boots on the floorboards. He'd been up since the stove went cold, chopping wood in the dark. My job was to break the ice in the water barrel and scoop it into a pot. We boiled it for tea, and the steam would fog the windows so thick you couldn't see the frozen world outside. School was a wooden building with frost creeping down the walls inside the classroom. We wore our fur coats during lessons, mittens with the fingers cut off so we could still hold a pencil. Ink froze in the wells, so we learned to write fast if the mercury dropped too far. Past -55°C, classes were canceled, but not for the reason you think. Not because it was too cold, but because the fuel in the school's generator would turn to jelly and the lights wouldn't come on. The playground was just the snow itself. We dug tunnels in drifts taller than a man, slid down icy slopes, and built forts that could last until April without melting. There were no screens to pull us inside, no Wi-Fi to scroll through. Our entertainment was the crunch of boots in snow, the taste of pine resin on our tongues, the way your eyelashes froze together if you blinked too slow. The cold shaped everything. Milk came in frozen bricks. Bread was so hard you had to chop it with an axe, and even your own face became unfamiliar when frost turned your eyebrows white. I remember the smell of smoke clinging to every coat, every scarf, not because we liked it, but because it meant you'd been near a fire. When darkness fell, which was most of the day in December, the village gathered, sometimes in the school, sometimes in someone's house. We told stories about hunters who followed wolf tracks for days, about reindeer that knew when a storm was coming, about neighbors who disappeared into the snow and came back with tales no one could believe. These were our movies, our games, our internet. Every child knew that listening well was just as important as speaking, because in the Arctic, stories weren't entertainment. They were survival instructions. I didn't know I was missing anything. I didn't know there was a world where you could see the face of a friend without standing in the same room. My world was smaller, yes, but it was sharp, clear, and made of things you could touch. The sound of firewood splitting, the sting of snow on your cheeks, the taste of bread baked that morning because nothing kept soft for long. That was childhood at -71°C, a place where the cold was always in the room with you, even if you didn't speak about it, where life moved at the speed of a sled dog's trot, and the only connection that mattered was the one you could feel in your hands. Part 2. The winter games without screens. People in warmer lands talk about childhood games like they were something bought in a shop. In our village, games were invented on the spot, shaped by snowdrifts, frozen rivers, and the fact that your mittens couldn't hold anything small without dropping it. The most popular game was snow maze. After a storm, the men of the village cleared paths between the houses, narrow, twisting corridors carved through snowbanks taller than the tallest reindeer antlers. To us kids, this became a frozen labyrinth. We chased each other through it until our breath came in white clouds so thick we could barely see. There were rules. If you dropped your mitten in the snow and couldn't find it in 30 seconds, it was claimed by whoever spotted it first. Losing a mitten was no small thing. The cold could burn your skin raw in less than a minute. On weekends, we raced sleds on the frozen river, not the sleek wooden sleds you see in postcards. Ours were made from whatever could slide, an old car hood, a door taken off its hinges. My cousin once tried to ride a big sheet of ice like a raft, but it cracked under him and drifted downriver. We still laugh about that, though he came home with eyebrows frozen solid. And a story about how the river tried to eat him, fishing. In winter was another game, though the stakes were higher. We'd follow the men out onto the ice, carrying hand drills and wooden buckets. They'd cut neat circles into the ice and sit for hours, waiting for a fish to make a mistake. We kids didn't have the patience, so we made bets, not about who would catch the biggest fish, but who could hold their bare hand in the icy water the longest. The winner got the best seat near the stove that night. The loser, usually, a red, stinging hand for the rest of the evening. When it wasn't too cold for our eyelashes to freeze shut, we played Sky Watch. The sky in the Arctic is its own kind of entertainment. Northern lights danced across it like ribbons of green fire, twisting and folding in slow motion. We'd lie in the snow, coats pulled tight, and watch for hours. Sometimes the elders told us the lights were spirits playing ball with a walrus skull. Sometimes they said it was a warning that hunters were out too long, and the spirits were calling them home. But winter games weren't all fun. They were training. You learned how to run across ice without falling, how to spot a snowdrift hiding a hole in the river, how to find the way home in a whiteout. The adults never called it training. They just let us figure it out. But the lesson was always the same. The Arctic doesn't care how old you are. If you make a mistake, the cold will punish you just the same as a grown man, even indoors. Games were about survival. My grandmother taught us thread the needle, where you had to fix a tear in your coat using thick fur thread and a bone needle. The faster you could do it, the more respect you earned. Another indoor game was firekeeper. Someone had to feed the stove at just the right moment to keep the embers alive without wasting wood. It wasn't exciting until the fire almost went out. Then it became the most important game of your life. Without screens, we learned to look closely at things. You could tell which sled dog was in a bad mood just by the angle of its ears. You knew the sound of your father's boots in the snow compared to your uncle's. You could smell when the tea water was just about to boil, even before the steam rose. These were the notifications of our world, and missing them could mean missing dinner, missing a story, or missing a warning to stay indoors. We didn't call it living without internet. We called it living, and we never felt disconnected because our connections were everywhere. In the crunch of snow underfoot, in the shared laughter that froze in the air, in the glow of the stove on a night when the wind outside was trying to tear the roof off. That was our entertainment. That was our childhood. A life where you never needed a glowing screen to know exactly who you were and where you belonged. Part 3, Lessons from the Frozen World in a Place Where Winter lasts 9 months. The line between childhood and adulthood is thin, thinner than the ice on the river in early spring. At 10 years old, you were already expected to know things city kids never dreamed of. How to set a fish net under the ice, how to check a reindeer's hooves for frostbite, how to hear the difference between a blizzard starting and just another. Windy Day. School was a single-room wooden building that smelled of seal oil lamps and wet fur coats. The teacher doubled as the postmaster and sometimes as the medic. We learned reading and numbers, but half the lessons were about the land, the way snow changes color before it collapses into a hidden crevasse, the tracks left by an Arctic fox compared to a stray dog. The blackboard might hold a math problem in the morning and a diagram of how to gut a fish by the afternoon. The older boys always bragged about their first hunt, not the kind of hunt with rifles. Rifles were precious, and bullets were worth more than coins. A first hunt usually meant chasing ptarmigan with snares, or waiting hours near a breathing hole to catch a seal. My first catch was a rabbit. I cornered near a woodpile. I remember bringing it home in both hands, my gloves stiff with frost, proud like I'd brought down a bear. My grandfather just nodded and told me, next time, try not to scare all the other rabbits. Food wasn't bought, it was earned. When you had fresh meat, everyone ate. When the hunt failed, you learned how to make a meal from nothing. Reindeer fat melted into broth, dried fish pounded into powder and mixed with berries from last summer. The adults never said, "We're poor." They just said, "We'll eat different tonight." The cold was a teacher too, and it never accepted excuses. If you forgot to bring in your boots at night, they'd freeze so hard you could knock them like wooden blocks in the morning. If you didn't tie down the sled right, the wind would drag it halfway to the next settlement. If you were careless enough to sweat in the wrong clothes, you'd be shivering for hours, and nobody would rush to save you unless you really couldn't walk. That wasn't cruelty. That was the Arctic reminding you, pay attention or pay the price. But the Arctic wasn't just a place of hardship, it was a place of stories. Every elder had one. Some were warnings, some were entertainment, and most were both. My favorite was about the snowman, not the kind made from 3 round balls of snow, but a huge figure that appeared during whiteouts, following travelers just out of sight. My uncle swore he'd seen it once, a shadow in the snow, moving when he moved, stopping when he stopped. He said the trick was never to turn your back. As a child, I didn't know if it was a myth or a memory, but on stormy nights, I still found myself glancing over my shoulder. We didn't need internet to feel connected to the wider world. News traveled in fur-lined boots. Someone from another village would arrive with stories about ice breaking early in the south, or a polar bear seen too close to the houses in the east. These weren't just gossip, they were warnings shaping the way we prepared for the days ahead. And when there was nothing urgent to do, we simply existed. We sat with the dogs, listening to their low, contented breathing. We walked to the river just to see how the ice had shifted. We watched the smoke from chimneys curl against the pale sky. Life wasn't fast, but it was full. Every hour had its weight. In those moments, you learned something no screen could teach you. How to be still, how to hear the world without noise, how to be part of a place so vast and unforgiving that it made you feel small, but never unimportant. Part 4. The value of silence. By the time you reached your teenage years in the Arctic, you understood something most outsiders never would. The land didn't care about you, but it gave you everything you had. Respect wasn't just for people. It was for the ice, the wind, the dogs, the tools you used every day. You never slammed a door in winter because it might be the only thing keeping the cold from swallowing you whole. You never left a knife lying in the snow because metal that froze too long could snap like glass. We had no glowing screens, no constant stream of voices from far away. The voices we heard were the ones around the fire, telling stories as the oil lamp flickered. At night, the world outside was so quiet you could hear the snow settling, a faint, soft sound like breathing. That silence was never empty. It was heavy, alive, full of things you couldn't see but knew were there. Foxes padding through the dark, reindeer shifting in their sleep, the river groaning under its ice. On the coldest nights, when the mercury dropped to -71°C, it was almost dangerous to talk too much outside. Your breath froze to your eyelashes. Your scarf turned to a sheet of ice in minutes. Movement was deliberate. Walk to the sled, feed the dogs, check the firewood, then back inside before your fingers forgot they were part of you. We didn't complain. The cold was simply the shape of our world. Friendship felt different without phones. You didn't text someone to see if they wanted to meet. You walked through the snow to their house and hoped they were there. And if they weren't, you might sit with their grandmother for an hour, sipping hot tea and listening to her tell the same story you'd heard a dozen times before. In that way, the whole village was your family, whether you wanted it or not. Entertainment wasn't about what you could watch, it was about what you could make. We built sled tracks on the hillside and raced down on frozen fish crates. We carved little reindeer from driftwood, painting them with soot and seal fat to make them shine. We played games that had no name, no rules written down, just something passed from one generation of kids to the next, shaped by each winter's imagination. There were hard lessons, too. One boy in our village tried to walk home alone from a fishing spot during a sudden storm. He was only a few hundred meters from his family's door when they found him, barely able to stand, his face covered in ice. He survived, but after that, no one in the village forgot how quickly the land could turn on you. We didn't need weather apps to warn us. We had the horizon, the wind, and the way the dogs started pacing before a blizzard. Looking back, I realize that growing up without the internet wasn't about being cut off. It was about being anchored. The stories we carried weren't ones we read online. They were lived. repeated and woven into the fabric of the place. Every scar on a sled runner, every worn patch on a coat, every old joke told for the 100th. Time was part of who we were. People sometimes ask if I ever wished for more things, more connection, more information. But the truth is, the Arctic gave me more than enough. It gave me the patience to wait without fidgeting, the skill to fix something with my hands instead of buying new, the understanding that silence can be the loudest teacher, and maybe most importantly, it gave me the sense that no matter how far the world moves forward, there's a value in knowing how to live without it. We didn't measure our days by Wi-Fi signals or battery life. We measured them by how much wood was stacked by the stove, by the color of the sky at noon, by the stories told before bed. And when the northern lights dance across the sky, you didn't need a phone to share it. You just stood there, side by side, your breath rising in clouds, watching the sky burn green over a land too cold for anything but truth.